London's past is steeped in conflict. The size and shape of the city were for hundreds of years dictated by the threat of war. War is a terrible and destructive force, but actually it's played an enormous part in shaping London as the city is today. Just below me, to the south of London Bridge, is the spot where London was actually founded, because in about AD 50, two Roman roads were diverted to meet at this point, and those roadworks were the beginning of London. When they'd finished the roadworks, they built a bridge, and a settlement sprang up on both sides of the river. The Romans established good relations with local tribes, and the new city began to prosper. But they'd reckoned without a nasty revolt. Londinium's buildings were made of wattle and daub. There was no local stone, and few defences had been built. The city was fat and vulnerable, like a sitting duck. And the person who inflicted this destruction on the undefended was a woman, Boudicca, or Boadicea as we used to call her when I was a lad. She was queen of the Iceni, a fierce tribe from East Anglia, and when she came charging into London, they were so terrified they ran for their lives, leaving just the women and the children to be slaughtered. In fact, when the archaeologists came to look, the only thing they found from this period was a layer of red clay where the whole place had been burnt to the ground, and a whole lot of skulls in the Warburg River. Nevertheless, in spite of the lack of stone, London was soon built up again, and this time they made sure there were fortifications. Now, you may wonder why I'm going into an underground car park. Well, it's not because the Romans parked their chariots down here, although actually they may have, because in Roman times, ground level was down here, 6 meters below where it is today. No, I'm going because behind these two doors is the remains of a massive Roman building project, one that determined the shape of London for 1,500 years. Just look at this. This is part of the original Roman wall, built all the way around the city of London. But in fact, this wasn't the first military building they did, because they needed somewhere to house their soldiers, and so they built a fort. And this is one of the gatehouses, and the rest of the fort would have been in the back there somewhere, and that's where the Romans would have been having their breakfast, or whatever Roman soldiers do. They built the gatehouse around AD 120, and they started on the wall something like 80 years later. And it's astonishing how good the condition of the masonry is. Just look at this here. Absolutely, it could have been built last week. Well, a few years ago anyway. And if you listen very carefully, you can almost hear those Roman soldiers back there brushing their teeth, polishing their weapons. No, perhaps it's just the traffic overhead.
The wall stretched around Londinium for 2 miles. It was to form the boundary of the city for more than 1,500 years. The area it encompassed is now the heart of the City of London.
Building this wall was an absolutely mammoth operation. Just look at it, it's 6 meters high, and it's something like 3 meters thick. And the whole lot is built of these amazing stones. Now, there was no local stone. London is built on clay, so they had to import this stuff, ragstone. And they had to bring in something like 1 million of these. How on earth did they get here?
I went across the city to another section of the wall at Cooper's Close to meet Jenny Hall, the Roman curator at the Museum of London.
Well, Roman London didn't have any available building stone, so it had to be got from further afield, and it comes from the Medway area of Kent. They quarried it from there.
That's 100 miles away.
It came by boat, and we know that there were boatloads bringing up this building stone to Roman London, because one of the boats actually sunk at the mouth of the fleet, and we found some of its cargo of ragstone in it.
So when was the wall built?
Well, we think it was built about AD 200, but it's a coin that was found in rubbish that had built up against the wall that helps us give a date to it.
Right.
And that is a silver coin.
Oh, fabulous.
Of Caracalla.
So that's genuine silver?
Yes, and this coin dates to AD 213 to 217. What's interesting about this coin, found with it were some moulds, and someone has taken a fresh silver coin and pressed it into the clay to make moulds, so that we've got a forger at work.
How many do you find?
Over 700.
700? This is a serious industry then.
Very serious, yeah.
Gosh,
yes.
Forgers at work.
Yeah, at a time when there was rampant inflation, so they obviously sort of wanted a lot of extra coinage.
Oh, fantastic. Successive generations built the wall up higher and higher to keep out all those aggressors. And when they ran out of aggressors, they started using the wall for other things. Now, just look at this bit. These are just platform sockets, but look up there. That was obviously an arrow slit. You can still see the slit at the bottom. And then above it, recycled Roman tiles. And then they bricked the whole thing up, presumably because the people living inside couldn't stand the drafts. Have a look round here. Now here you can see that the wall's actually been converted into a house. Look, there's a flight of stairs going up. And then there's a fireplace up in the bedroom. Lucky people. I don't have a fireplace in my bedroom.
Bits of the wall survived throughout the City of London, but one section was discovered more recently right next to one of London's major tourist attractions.
For 200 years, the only defence on the south side of Londinium was the river. But then about AD 390, the Romans decided they needed something more solid, and they built this. In fact, you can still see down here the orange tiles that they so often built into their walls. And this wall was to play an important role in the development of London's defences. Because when the Normans came along, the fact that the wall was here and on a prominent position overlooking the Thames meant this was the perfect place for them to make their mark. And look, they built to last. After his victory at the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror still had to face the wrath of a whole lot of angry Saxon Londoners. In fact, it was so dangerous in the city that he had to go and live out in Essex, and they hadn't even built the Central Line then. In order to calm down his new subjects, he had to intimidate them, and he ordered his soldiers to build certain strongholds within the town against the fickleness of this vast and fierce populace. And the biggest of those strongholds was this colossal tower. It's 90 feet high, it's 118 feet wide. It was the biggest thing they'd ever seen. In fact, this hugely ambitious building was the second largest Norman tower in the world. Jane Spooner is curator of historic buildings here at the tower. Jane, who built this wonderful tower?
Well, we know that from 1077 onwards it was built by Gundulf, the Bishop of Rochester.
Oh, wonderful. A bishop?
Exactly, yes.
Sounds unlikely, doesn't it? So, what was it built for?
We've got two defensive functions going on here, in that it's seen by anybody coming upriver, and also it's seen by the citizens of London, who were particularly rebellious.
And it must have been terrifying, that sort of height.
Absolutely. It was terrifying for a number of reasons. One was that it was a very large stone building, which the Saxons wouldn't really have seen much of before, and that immediately denoted power, wealth, dominion. It's a very effective fortress, and it was built from stone. Its entrance isn't on the ground, it's high up, so you have to make an effort to get to it. And also, some of the walls are at least 4 metres thick in parts.
4 metres?
Absolutely.
Wow.
So it's a very, very strong fortress building.
William's Tower still dominates the site today, but his descendants carried on strengthening the fortifications. One of the biggest builders was Richard the Lionheart, who spent only a few months of his reign in England, but spent huge amounts on fortifying the tower and its outer walls.
One of the most interesting buildings that survives from Richard's day is this, the Bell Tower. This was, incidentally, where they locked up Sir Thomas More for the last 15 months of his life. But in Richard's time, what's interesting is this extraordinary polygonal shape to the ceiling. That's actually a very early example of Gothic, and they used it extensively much later on to hold up the roofs of churches. This tower is actually the second oldest in the whole complex. Only the White Tower is older. But the shape of the whole Tower of London wasn't settled until many years later.
Henry III was responsible for building a curtain wall which surrounds William's original tower. Edward I carried on the programme of improvements and built a second curtain wall and the moat. He created the concentric castle that you see today. This wasn't a new idea, but Edward the Master Builder developed it to the point of perfection.
Anyone who wanted to attack the tower would have a pretty tough job. First of all, they've got to get in off the river, okay, that's not easy. And then outside that wall, there was a moat. It might have been 9 metres deep and full of raw sewage. Then there are chaps firing arrows from that wall to deter them, and even if they can get over it, they're then stuck in this space between the walls with chaps firing arrows from there and from here, because there are trained archers with longbows shooting down. Take that, you rotter! Ah, got him! And even if they can get over this wall, then they've got to go and attack the tower, 90 feet high. I wouldn't fancy it.
Even today, the tower remains a very secure place. After all, the crown jewels are still kept here.
Halt! Who got her?
The keys!
Whose keys?
Queen Elizabeth's keys!
Of course, there is one weakness in the tower's defences. Legend has it that if these ravens leave the Tower of London, it will crumble, and the kingdom itself will fall apart.
This is the Royal Naval College at Greenwich, which was originally built as a seamen's hospital by Christopher Wren. And Britain's most famous sailor, Horatio Lord Nelson, lay in state under one of the domes while people came past to pay their respects. The rise of the Navy really started under Henry VIII, who curiously had a palace down here. He was an aggressive chap and he attacked France and was terrified that we'd be attacked in turn. So he built up the Navy and he built an enormous chain of coastal defences all the way from Hull all the way around to Milford Haven.
This fort at Tilbury was established by Henry to protect London from attack by sea. England's defences relied on intercepting would-be invaders before they landed. The fort was massively enlarged by Charles II, who feared attack by the Dutch. Elizabeth I built this fort, Upnor Castle, to protect her massive new naval dockyards at Chatham in Kent. It was overrun in 1667 when the Dutch sailed up the Medway and burnt the British fleet in the docks, humiliating Charles II. The threat of invasion remained very real until Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815. London entered an unprecedented period of prosperity and was safe from attack by land or sea for nearly 100 years. The next threat was to come from the air.
Before the war, London was the greatest city in the world. It was the hub of a vast empire and home to 8 million people. But the Blitz changed all that. Terrible bombing. Just look here. Here is a row of Victorian houses built around 1850. Along comes a massive bomb and flattens 15 of them. Here we are. All this lot was rebuilt after the war. Churchill himself predicted that 1 week of bombing might produce 40,000 casualties. He described London as the greatest target in the world, a tremendous, fat, valuable cow. But in spite of all that, the authorities didn't want to dig any deep shelters for the people. They thought that everyone might be so happy to be down there, they'd be too frightened to come up again into the open air. So what most Londoners had was one of these. This is an Anderson shelter, named after the Home Secretary at the beginning of the war. And basically it's a hole in the ground with a bit of, well, earth over the top really, and you had to build it yourself. Les, I'm a bit young to remember Anderson shelters, but you had one, didn't you?
Yes, we had one, and I also helped to put it up and build it with my father and my brother.
How old were you?
I was only 8 years old at the time.
Oh, wow. Did you have to make it yourself?
Yes, we had to construct it ourselves. They bought these shelter parts on a lorry and just left them with you. We then had to dig the hole out, and then it was constructed, we stood it up, bolted it together with the bolts in the top. Along the back there was a bar onto which bolted the escape hatch, because the centrepiece in the middle was so that you could get out the back if it had if it got blocked up at the front. Then you put the earth over the top, and that was it.
Right. How much earth on top?
The more the better, really. If you didn't have any, you could have got shrapnel falling down, even maybe not from bombs, but even from the guns, and it could have possibly have gone through the shelter. By having the earth on the top, of course, it stopped any stuff getting in there. The only thing used to get in was water.
More than 2 million Anderson shelters were distributed to the public, but they offered only limited protection from the destruction of the Blitz. Londoners who didn't have a garden had in theory only the option of the street-level shelters that the government had provided. They too were extremely cramped and again didn't provide much protection from a direct hit. Within days, others had found their own solution: buy a penny ticket for the tube and sleep on the platforms.
The people who ran the country didn't really have much more protection than the average Londoner. There were plans to build deep underground shelters way outside London, but then people might think they were being deserted. So in the end, they came here to what had been the Office of Works. It was reckoned to be a strong building, and of course it had a basement, which was very handy. It was close by number 10 Downing Street and also the Houses of Parliament. And so this became the Central Emergency Headquarters, now known as the Cabinet War Rooms. This is the War Cabinet Room. It's quite exciting to be down here. This was where the Cabinet met for the first time on the 15th of October 1940. At least that was the first time Churchill came down here, because the day before a bomb had actually damaged 10 Downing Street, and he realised that the heads of government ought to be underground and a bit further away from the bombs. I'm sitting in the seat of the Cabinet Secretary. This is Churchill's chair. That would have been Attlee, and there were the three chiefs of staff in the middle of the room. But the war was really run from this room. This was where Churchill worked incredibly long hours. If necessary, he even slept here. And you'll see that all the walls are covered in maps, and just in case anyone dodgy came round, there were curtains that he could draw to cover the maps up and hide all his secrets. Now, the chap who really knows about these rooms, and this one in particular, is Neil Cook here, who was involved with the restoration of the whole building. Neil, why did they choose this building?
Well, some people suggest that it was because of its proximity to Downing Street.
It's only sort of 20 yards or something, isn't it?
Exactly. But I think possibly the real reason is that this was originally a windowless, fireproof archive store for architectural drawings. And the thought was that they could deliver materials here and that the work to fortify the place could actually go on unseen.
How did they fortify the building?
They brought in millions of bricks. They brought in enough steel sheeting to probably cover a football pitch. Into that they cast concrete about 5 feet thick, and the whole of that was supported on about over 900 steel beams. And of course Churchill used to come along and watch the bricklaying as it
and he was a bricklayer, wasn't he?
Well, he was a member of the Bricklayers Union, and he built a lot of walls down at Chartwell. And there's one story actually which John Colville, his private secretary during the war, recorded in his diary, which is that Churchill was wandering about on the steel beams as they were casting the slab, and jumped off and landed in some wet concrete. But it'd be kind of funny to imagine this
wonderful
large red-tanned man
yes.
sort of up to his waist in concrete.
Well, yes.
Outside, not only had hundreds of London's historic buildings been damaged or destroyed, but by the end of the Blitz, vast tracts of the city had been wiped out. The terrible damage caused by the war had changed the face of London forever.
London had to be rebuilt, and some people saw this as a great opportunity to put up wonderful new structures.
Like this, the Barbican complex. It was built because the Corporation of London was worried about the decline in population of the square mile caused by the Blitz. Flats were built around gardens and water features, creating a haven in the middle of the city.
The Barbican is absolutely massive. It includes that church over there, that tower, and this enormous concrete block with these miles and miles of walkways. It makes it feel almost like a walled town, which is actually rather appropriate because the word Barbican means a fortified outpost. Now, some people see it as a terrific triumph because with these walkways, the space for pedestrians is doubled, and it's a sort of oasis away from all the noise of the traffic underneath. Other people see it as an absolute nightmare because once you get inside, you can never find your way around. It's far too easy to get lost in there. opinion on the Barbican is sharply divided. There was a recent poll among Londoners to try and find the best and worst buildings in the city, and the Barbican was voted the 12th best and the 11th worst.
The Barbican's use of concrete towers paved the way for dozens of other high-rise developments across London. Many, though, were built on the cheap. In some areas, there was only enough money for the most basic social housing. Post-war regeneration is still going on. Parts of the docklands have lain abandoned for more than 50 years. London still faces one major threat, though. But unlike the guns and bombs of foreign invaders, it's come from the very source of London's prosperity, the River Thames. London has always been at risk of flooding, but it took the Canvey Island disaster of 1953 for a serious solution to take shape.
This is it. This is the world's largest movable flood barrier. It stretches 520 metres right across the Thames, and you can see there's a whole bunch of piers there with a sort of silver pagoda on top of each. Now, between each pair of piers, there's a huge steel gate. It's like, well, imagine a vast oil drum chopped in half down the middle, lying on its side on the bottom of the river, and it can tilt up like that and actually lock off, shut off the river from the sea. And you'll see that number 4 actually is already up. They're repairing it or something. So they can completely separate the sea and the river. It was built, this, 21 years ago, and it's been raised only 80 times since then, but it's happening more often now, and with global warming and the rising sea level, they're going to have to think of something better quite soon.
If not, the city that has repelled so many invaders could fall victim to something as simple as the rising tide.